So much of 2012 had been so miserable so far, we were conditioned to expect the inevitable crapness of everything, and the Olympics were clearly going to be nothing but bad news. For one thing, we couldn't afford it. The country didn't have a pot to piss in apart from Plymouth. The weather, the weather was going to be awful as well. It had rained consistently throughout the summer. The country was being waterboarded, basically. There was moss growing on the inside of clouds. The ticketing system didn't work. London's transport network was completely knackered.
Absolutely total. Those people, they haven't got a clue what they're doing.
And security, yes, security was all a bollocks.
They had to call the army in, and they immediately went mental and started positioning surface-to-air missiles on anything over chest height.
When the flame made its way to the stadium, it might as well be lighting a bomb fuse.
That flame was already touring the country, where it was being carried by many goodwill ambassadors and one bad Will.I.am. Yes, it's Dick Hughes again, texting and moonwalking while carrying the thing. You know, I'm not sure quite why I find him so irritating, but I think I've narrowed it down to this little bit in his hair.
Lots of different cheery celebrities carried the torch.
This showbiz knight struck a familiar pose on the site of the 1908 Olympics,
which he'd attended as an old man.
Olympics fever was being accompanied by plenty of gaudy advertising, as you could see from the coverage.
Which gave rise to another complaint about the Games, that they were clearly going to be nothing but a depressing logo-strewn corporate egg and spoon contest.
The nation's ad breaks creaked with one patronising faux inspirational propaganda movie after another, with legendary Olympians and Paralympians pimping goods and occasionally farting out corporate insignia willy-nilly as apparently random products and services jostled desperately to associate themselves with that wholesome Olympic glow. Given all this, the Olympics were clearly going to be ghastly.
And as the opening ceremony loomed, smartasses everywhere tried to work out what the emoticon for sneering was.
Of course, in the event, Danny Boyle's opening show was a heartwarming spectacle that made everyone in the country intensely patriotic.
The coverage of the opening ceremony was amazing. It wasn't just the most spectacular broadcast ever, it was educational because it taught you all about British history. Like how we started out as primitive Morris dancers and cricket people, all living in this field. And then Abraham Lincoln turned up and started shouting at everyone. And like chimneys grew out of the ground, rising up like big sort of penises made out of bricks. And it showed you how the Victorians invented Gangnam Style and how we got invaded by the people from the Quality Street tin. And how the mafia turned up to help us, but they were black. And then this volcano went off and we hit the lava with hammers until it flew into the air and turned into the Olympics. And I didn't know any of that actually happened, but it had all actually happened.
The next morning, it was as if we cautiously realised that maybe, since we hadn't totally ballsed the ceremony up, maybe the rest of the Games would be OK too. Usually, I find watching any sport less interesting than watching, say, cardboard exist. But for some reason, I couldn't stop watching the Olympics.
I think it's because I'm a nerd and it reminded me of video games, thanks to the video game style cutscene the BBC displayed whenever its coverage booted up, and the electric colour tones and crisp overlaid graphics showing who was in which lane, and the high score table and the Tron style fencing tournaments, and the velodrome coverage which looked like Battle of the Planets on wheels, and the occasional weightlifting competitor who looked like an end-of-level boss who might suddenly lob a boulder at you or something.
And of course, thanks to the new Olympic tradition of doing signature gestures like Usain Bolt's thingamajig or the Mobot.
Yes, the presence of the cameras prompted many athletes to perform a fancy starting move before their event, a bit like the pre-fight animation for a character from the video game Tekken. The cameras captured many pre-bout player animations. There was the rearing tiger, the sinister squint, the burst hemorrhoid, the who the bloody hell are you looking at, and the I'm going to rip my nipples off and throw them at the crowd. In fact, the only one missing was Gangnam Style.
As well as looking like a game, it was a game we were good at.
The blanket coverage presented us with a wealth of fresh-faced, clean-living British youngsters apparently fixated on being the very best they could be. Bastards.
People started talking about what inspiring role models the Olympics were providing for a whole generation for once.
I mean, compare them to the sort of gaudy role models our youth are usually presented with, like the nihilistic, boozy attention addicts on MTV's raucous sex and shrieking reality shows Geordie Shore and the Valleys.
Pisha's gone crazy. She keeps pulling up my skirt and flashing my foof. I'm not having that, so I shove an ice cube in her knickers. And another one up her arsehole.
At last, thanks to the Olympics, our young folk were being represented by genuine achievers. They weren't dedicating their lives to pointless nonsense. They were doing real things like jumping over a bar into some sand or throwing a disc or a stick really well once every 4 years.
Athletics provided many high points in the already euphoric coverage, such as the moment Mo Farah pulled off a spectacular win in the 10,000 metres, after which a nation held its breath hoping he wouldn't roll into the phlegm freshly flobbed onto the track by a fellow athlete. All our fears had been unfounded. The weather was great, the systems worked, and it didn't feel like a big corporate shindig because it was all on the ad-free BBC. In fact, the only thing being advertised was Britain. The schedules heaved with emotive, triumphant, romantic, slow-motion montages which managed to somehow mythologise the games before they were even quite over.
Patriotism was now at a peak. There was nothing the UK couldn't do. We were invincible. We were unstoppable. We were superior.
F*** off Frenchman, f*** off German, f*** off American.
We could do World War II all over again in our sleep if we wanted. We were the best nation on earth. Anything we put our mind to, we could achieve. Then we had the Paralympics, which also defied expectations by being about 10,000 times better than many were expecting.
In fact, if anything, they were better than the Olympics because half these sports hadn't received anything like this much jubilant coverage before, and the athletes were truly inspiring.
The Paralympics changed the way we looked at disability forever. For instance, now when I see someone in a wheelchair, I think, bloody show-off.
Almost every single aspect of the coverage was brilliantly life-affirming. For instance, here we see a man who lost both his charisma and respect in a tragic voting accident, triumphing in the 500 decibel boo.
Chancellor of the Exchequer. They hate me, they really hate me.
If you thought you'd seen a lot of the royals throughout 2012, what with the Queen popping up every 5 seconds like a mushroom in a Mario game, you hadn't seen half as much of them as you were about to.
First, Prince Harry, who'd been having a pretty good year, showcasing his stunning ability to blend into almost any surroundings, was photographed nude in a Vegas hotel room. Channel 4 News were so delighted they took Harry's bum on a walkabout tour where it could greet its subjects.
That's what he's been up to.
Is that really him?
That's really him. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's going a bit too far.
Ask her if she thinks he's wiped properly. Others were less amused, notably The Palace and The Sun newspaper, which considered this a terrible throwback to a more primitive age, before the internet let us see any bum we wanted.
And the News dutifully recorded its front-page blow for press freedom.
For us, this is about the freedom of the press. This is about our readers getting involved in the discussion with the man who is third in line to the throne. It's as simple as that.
Yes, and that discussion goes, can I see your bum? No.
But a few weeks after this brave attempt to let their readers see a bum, press commitment to free speech was tested by another story involving royalty.
Or rather, royal TNA.
Because the Duchess of Cambridge, seen here exiting the I'm a Celebrity jungle with Ben Fogle, was also snapped in a state of undress, as the News sadly and soberly informed its viewers.
This report does contain flash photography.
Bet it does. The Kate snaps were so disgraceful, the British media turned its censorship filters up to maximum blur to prevent the merest hint of regal flesh exposure. I actually thought I'd developed glaucoma.
Ben and the Duchess, who are currently appearing on the Solomon Islands version of Big Brother, were absolutely livid.
But some people couldn't understand the upset. People like this boggle-eyed French paparazzo.
For me, it's so stupid. Because she's a young lady, she's nice, she's not fat, she's beautiful. So you have to show them.
Yes, that is the law in France. You have to show them.
Are you going to show the pictures on your program? Of course not. So it's a kind of hypocrisy.
No, he's right, you know. I mean, we've got no problem showing French tits. I mean, here's a big French tit.
Throughout the year, print journalism got it in the neck on TV, and Sky News often heaved with surreal reports about newspaper folk.
Scotland Yard's confirmed that it loaned the former News International chief executive Rebecca Brooks a police horse.
Sounds outrageous, although it was a retired horse, and let me tell you, if you'd seen the photos of that poor, exhausted-looking mare with its straggly mane and haunted eyes, you'd think, that poor thing, she deserves a ride on a horse.
The fact that a Met horse is living with Rebecca Brooks for 2 years, it just strikes me as very unusual and reflects a relationship that was unhealthy.
And pretty uncomfortable, I'd have thought.
But Brooks wasn't the only former Sun editor on the receiving end. In the wake of the Hillsborough scandal, beloved national treasure and front-page lie printer Kelvin Mackenzie was subjected to disgraceful yet hilarious harassment by a Channel 4 News crew.
Don't assault me. Don't assault me.
I didn't realise Kelvin Mackenzie had a doorstep. I thought he entered the world each morning by slithering through a haunted mirror into our realm.
But things were about to get even worse for the press when Lord Justice Leveson published his report,
which threatened the future of print journalism simply by using up all the f***ing paper on Earth.
There was this thing, right, called the Lesbian Inquiry, sort of like a talk show hosted by this Brian Lesbian bloke. It was like if Chatty Man was on in the afternoon, except it wasn't like Chatty Man, because even though it had all these celebrity guests, their anecdotes were sort of unhappy.
I was relentlessly pursued by about 10 to 15 men.
You could tell the audience were depressed because they didn't laugh much. And instead of a big musical number from, like, Adele at the end, they brought out this report. There's no way it's coming back for a second series. It didn't really work as a format.
This Chris Jeffries bloke was in loads of reports carping on saying he'd been mistreated by the press and everything. And you're like, mate, you're on telly. I wouldn't have even heard of you if it wasn't for the papers. And you wouldn't have even sorted your hair out if they hadn't pointed out how weird it was. You know, show some gratitude.
September, always a big month for movies. And, well, look, you know what it's like when you've read a book and you really like one of the characters in it, and then someone makes a film of it and they just ruin it. Well, that.
Spreading across the Arab world, violent protests over the American film that mocks Islam.
Yes, tempers flared when a shoddy trail for a deliberately provocative anti-Islam propaganda flick called The Innocence of Muslims was posted on the internet. As you could see from the blanket coverage, it got everything the studios usually want from a movie. Strong word of mouth, huge crowds, queues around the block and a lot of heat generated.
And if you think they're pissed off, you should see what they're saying about it on Rotten Tomatoes. Usually, Hollywood movies worship the prophet. I mean, profit's all they care about. But then, this wasn't a Hollywood movie, but an Islamophobic trash fest made by an imbecile called Sam Basile, seen here turning the news into an impromptu tribute to the Elephant Man when he was arrested. Like many movies, by the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, or a house, or an eye. It was the most hostile reception for any film this year, except Prometheus.
Now, call me reactionary, but personally, in the post-Savile environment, I don't think we should encourage our young folk to lionise flamboyantly dressed weirdos who claim to be doing good work, but Hollywood begs to differ.
The Dark Knight Rises is a superhero film for people who'd like to think they're watching The Seventh Seal, even though what they're actually watching is a children's film about a children's character who dresses up as a bat and hits people in the face.
Calling Batman the Dark Knight makes him sound more sophisticated than he is. It's a bit like calling Papa Smurf the Blue Patriarch.
The story is a sulky blancmange in which Le Cavalier Noir goes up against thunderous tough guy Bane, an angry bollock with a sort of child safety seatbelt mechanism glued to his face. Thing is, because Bane's every line is delivered through his alternate mask, you have to squint with your ears to understand what he's saying.
Our plan is proceeding as expected.
What?
Like shipwrecked men turning to seawater.
Huh?
I broke you.
What?
Here to end the borrowed time you've all been living on.
We're still thinking to nothing paid. And despite all the pretentious stylings, the plot actually makes less sense than Thomas and the Magic Railway. For one thing, Batman gets turned into Bad Batman fairly early on, and he spends ages lying around going, ow, ow, instead of being f***ing Batman, which is what you paid to see. The Dark Knight Rises isn't bad, but behind all the noir sheen, it's no more intellectually nourishing than the 1966 Batman movie, which was camp and loopy and fun, and never once mistook itself for Ingmar Bergman's From the Life of the Marionettes.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
Actually, that's almost identical to the end of Dark Knight Rises.
The Conservative Chief Whip, Andrew Mitchell, is under pressure tonight after reportedly swearing at a police officer in Downing Street and calling him a pleb.
Yes, in a hotly disputed event that did for the Tory image what seawater did for the Fukushima nuclear plant, Mitchell was accused of an altercation at the site of the gates Margaret Thatcher erected to keep plebs out. Since at first the media didn't have a recording of the event itself, Channel 4 News was forced to reconstruct it like an Ealing comedy with dialogue lifted from 50 Shades of Grey.
Open this gate. I'm the Chief Whip. I'm telling you, I'm the Chief Whip, and I'm coming through these gates.
This guy's almost as good as Brad Pitt in that Chanel ad.
You're f***ing plebs. Morons.
Soon Mitchell drove up to the TV cameras in a plebby little car to deny saying pleb, but apologised for general disrespect. Mind you, this wasn't enough for some police, who by now were proudly reclaiming the word pleb while campaigning against frontline cuts. Tough job when you're apparently not sure how a letterbox works. Still, never mind what the cops think, what do plebs make of it?
How would you like to be called a pleb?
Well, I'll probably just brush it off. I could be called a lot worse.
Thanks, pleb. Eventually, Mitchell resigned, thereby himself becoming a pleb who knew his place on the other side of the f***ing gate, moron.
Except shortly after we done did this piece, Channel 4 News unveiled shocking CCTV footage disputing the police version of events and indicating a lack of plebs in Plebgate, making this whole mess a plebless Plebgate gate.